Questions for Tom, if you can hand them to Steve or one of the other volunteers. Tom, why would any major oil company CEO want to acknowledge peak oil? And why would his shareholders want him to? It only leads to higher oil service costs, higher taxation to fund the transition, higher salaries for key employees, higher costs of M&A, mergers and acquisitions.
Would you repeat the first part? No, this is correct. I mean, there is a structural challenge with acknowledgement of what these challenges. We have seen, I think, a meaningful shift on the part of certain CEOs among the internationals and certainly within the rest of the industry. There are others who are in at best, an awkward position, and some would say an impossible position. I was at an industry gathering where I got to observe Boone Pickens and Rex Tillerson together, and Boone had some fun, as you can imagine, with Rex's company's view of where we're gonna get to in the next decade or two. So it's very difficult to acknowledge it, but it's also critical for those CEOs, and I find in my dealings with some of them, I don't deal with all of them as closely as I deal with some, but I find them certainly acting in good faith and real thoughtfulness in trying to reposition themselves given the power shift that's already occurred.
If we have a black swan event, what are the probabilities of massive government intervention, a windfall profits tax, rationing? If you were the energy czar, how would you handle?
Okay. Well, you know, we are going to get to a point, I suspect, where this does get on the radar screen of politicians. I doubt if it's going to happen between now and the next election, because there's a thing about it. This is too real a problem to try to address. And you know, our system is designed to really dumb this down, and so you know, I've been known to say the energy IQ of our Congress is 55, and I don't mean that as a personal impugnment of the individuals. There are some there that do understand this, but all their motivations, if you think there's a problem with motivating oil company CEOs to address the issue publicly, try anybody who's running for Congress to have them deal with this issue. But I think it's inescapable, given what we're talking about between now and the end of this decade, that we'll get to the next presidential election without this becoming an issue. And I used to have optimism. 5, 6, 7 years ago, I was very optimistic. We learned a lot of lessons from what happened in with the second oil spike, and that the windfall profits taxes and so on, and the end-use controls that we had in gas, et cetera, were all things that made the problem worse, not better. I'm not as optimistic today that the policy responses will reflect a true learning curve.
What would the impact of a severe recession have on oil and gas prices?
Well, you know, the way I put it this way, I was on CNBC yesterday, and the question was, what price is it going to take to change patterns of consumption? And I, wanting to be wrong on the low side, said somewhere between $90 and $120 a barrel, I think we'll begin to do it. I think that the move from, call it $30 oil to $88 oil largely has induced cumulative drag into the system. Is there some difference out there? Yes, but how much is it? Pretty minor, because if you think globally, you know, you find out that basically it's had no impact essentially in China, in the rest of Asia, in India, or in Europe. What's the price of oil today in Europe? It's about $62 a barrel equivalent when you think of $1.40, $1.41 to the euro to the dollar. So, you know, there's not the pain there, that we're talking about here, and even then, the increase in the price is a much smaller one because they've already taxed it. So when you think about those things, it really, we're headed for a rather different event, I think.
The Alaska gas pipeline, the early estimates were $15 billion 4 or 5, 6 years ago. The most recent one I've seen is $25 billion. Will it ever get built?
You know, I used to always answer that question because I've gotten that question for years, for a decade or more. And I used to always say, of course it will. You know, it's fully developed. We've got the best data on that gas reservoir of anything in the world today to be developed. But I underestimate the ability of policymakers to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, I guess. This project needs to be done, but I'm astounded at the inability of the 4 constituencies I mentioned earlier to get it done in a timely way. And I attribute that to a fundamental problem that we have today. There's too much noise in the system, in our financial systems, and cutting through the noise to what needs to be done strategically in order to know that your positioning is more secure in a decade from now has not happened. But I'm still optimistic it will. It'll probably be one of the few constructive things that happen coming out of the next round of addressing this issue.
Over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, will it be possible to discuss abandoning the philosophy of economic growth and begin creating a more steady state or sustainable economy?
Well, that's the big one. You know, Matt's chart where he posed the 2 questions, are 6.5 billion people too many, or are about 800 million vehicles too few? We are dealing with issues now that are going to get to that. You know, there have been studies by long-term thinkers about the ability of the planet to sustain 14 billion people. You know, I don't make any claim to being an authority on this, but I do have, and I'm left-handed, so I'm intuitive, and I believe that the systemic ability of the planet to sustain life as we've known it, or some life as we've known it sometime, is going to be less than what we calculate for water, food, and energy. And what we're learning with this, as somebody termed it, this tragic misstep with corn-based ethanol, is the linkages between water, food, and energy. And so, you know, I think we're going to have to make that transition. This will be a major historical inflection point as we come to grips with these things, with a lot of challenge and pain, and for those who are anticipatory, a lot of opportunity.
A lot of people believe Canada's increasing tar sands production will help cushion U.S. energy pain. Can you comment on that and the prospect that Alberta might increase its royalty take on?
Yeah, great question. I've said in a number of talks in the last 2 years, the most liquid fuel secure place on the planet, other than the Middle East, is from the western slopes of Appalachia to Salt Lake City because of Syncrude. That said, that doesn't mean there's going to be total insulation, and it's certainly not going to be a bargain, as we've seen with the most recent moves. But at least the availability of that fuel and the linkage of the appropriate market to the development of that is there. I also believe, however, that anybody who starts thinking it's going to be 1.2 million barrels a day becomes 2.5, becomes 3, 5, 8 is delusional. You know, I think we run into the environmental constraints around 3 million barrels a day, and that does a nice job of meeting mid-continent needs. So for another 2 decades, there's some room to make adjustments. Beyond that, I'm not so. And it's still going to be, the value of that resource is still going to be priced on the margin with world availability.
Last question. Oil closed today apparently at 89.45. A last comment or reflection. Sure. How are you invested?
Well, I can tell you that I'm not allowed to give you specific names under my my employment agreement with Merrill. Now, it's not my job. But, you know, look, development of economic supplies is critical as part of the equation. The enhanced oil recovery potentials, the LNG potentials, et cetera, are going to be critical to developing some flexibility in dealing with this. Let me just take one more minute, if I might, with oil pricing, because I think it is critical. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading last month's Barron's interview with Mike Rothman, former Merrill Fellow on the commodities side. He says he's predicting $45 oil. And somebody said to me, what do you think of that? And I said, he could be right. But I said, for him to be right, we've got to go a lot higher first. And my number's been, say, 120 or something like that. If we go to 120 quickly, I think you'll trigger Mike potentially being right, at least for a little while. Or it'll get down to the point where we worry about that kind of price. Absent that, and I said this at Art Smith's conference, I was talking about $120 oil at Art's conference, and sure enough, Charlie, who we'll get to hear from tomorrow, Charlie Maxwell, came in with 180 and 215 and 300 in 2020. And so the one risk in Matt's bet that we heard about today is that it goes real high soon, such that by the time it gets to 2010, we've already triggered that demand elasticity. But I think that's a very low risk. I think Matt's pretty money good on that bet.
Please give Tom one last hand of applause, please. Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.